workshop on the American Rescue Plan. Hold on, I have something coming here. Okay. Let's, why don't Ryan and Alex take it away, and then we'll have Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. We wanted to provide an update on what we do and do not yet know related to the American Rescue Plan today. This is formulated as a discussion just to continue the iterative discussion process around this work. And because I assume you're pretty much like Alex and I, where you get 9 questions a week on exactly what we're doing, when, where, how. I will start with, today was the first step in that process. As of today, the county board accepted the first tranche of American Rescue Plan funds that come directly to Ramsey County to the tune of approximately $53 million. And in the discussion we had on the workforce solutions piece in specificity, along with St. Paul, move forward a jobs program across Ramsey County focused on youth this summer. That was one of those tier 1 efforts that we wanted to move right away. It was on April 20th was the last time that we talked about the ARP. And I'm not going to go back through all the details, but for anyone who is watching and wants some grounding in what was the vision behind the ARP, how was Ramsey County thinking about it, the April 20th PowerPoint presentation and discussion, which is online and available on the website, allows people a chance to see where we're at. I will let you all know that other counties have paid attention to that discussion in their own formulation, particularly as we talked about the $106 million direct appropriation plus the X equals the total amount to Ramsey County. That framework, you may have heard this at the Association of Counties and other places, but that's taken hold in other places across the state and has been a real appreciated piece of the way we're trying to think this through. Our current X remains somewhat unknown. I mentioned this, I think it was last week actually, but we don't know how the allocations will flow from the feds to the state and then down to individual counties yet in many cases. We can extrapolate based on past precedent, and during the budget cycle, you're going to hear conversations on that because we're setting plans, assuming that Ramsey County would be situated like it has been in the past. I will be a booster for a minute locally to say, but the pandemic did not hit every county equally. And quite frankly, I would actually hope that the state might see that a disproportionate share of resource should come to the areas that have been most impacted, to the individuals on the ground most impacted. And so when we think about housing instability, mental health, chemical dependency, my hope is we may get more than what we set as an initial floor around that X amount of funding. The last thing I'll say on the X, and then we're going to move more toward a conversation today related to the direct appropriation, is that starting in July, I believe is what I have read, is when the direct payments to children, covering 88% of American children, will begin to be made to families across the United States. And I find that I start almost every conversation with this point because as systems, as government leaders, as communities, we just haven't existed in a world where there's a $300 monthly payment per child to almost 90% of American families. And that has a fundamental impact on the way in which families will have some level of funding coming to them to support themselves and continue to move forward. And we don't exactly know what that looks like, but we're asking that question a lot as we try to make plans around our own budget and around ARP, because it is truly a transformative piece of legislation. It may be transformative for only 12 months, and it may be longer. That's something left to be determined. As we talked last time about the different tiers, and Commissioner McDonough referenced the tiers earlier today during the workforce RBA discussion, I just wanted to briefly remind everyone what's there as we dive into specifics centered on what we've learned in terms of guidance. Tier 1 had included the public health ongoing response, workforce development, racial equity and community engagement, employee compensation, and finishing the funding for the emergency shelter expansion to 2022. I would actually say today, I would like to add one more that was not in that category explicitly, although it at the time sort of fit within the public health piece. It's violence prevention. We're working at multiple tables specifically on violence prevention, taking a public health approach in many cases to that violence prevention, but also partnering very closely with the city of St. Paul around a number of different violence prevention initiatives that will come forward. I would categorize that as a part of the tier 1. And as the ARP funding guidance has come out, as you'll hear today, that is an explicit call out in the guidance of areas too. So it has sharpened in our focus since our first conversation in April 20th. And I've been hearing from all of you as individuals and as a collective board, the need for us to be specific and make investments in violence prevention coming out of COVID. Tiers 2 and 3 related specifically to budget discussions, that remains a similar thought to where we were before, thinking about things like capital costs to transition from where we were to who we are, thinking about ways to preserve and enhance services while responding to and recovering from the COVID-19 impacts. Tier 4 was economic development post-pandemic, the ecosystem that world lives in. I believe I'll be declarative and say, I think we're beyond the world of direct appropriation grants to individual entities. That was an important part of the CARES funding package in particular. That's not currently a part of our strategic focus going forward. It's something that was needed to help blunt, but now how do you build an ecosystem so businesses and nonprofits can survive and thrive moving forward becomes a much bigger part of that conversation. Food basic needs, childcare, financial assistance also are in tier 4. That's where violence prevention was listed before, was in tier 4. And so what we're really seeing is an immediate need to move on some of it. And then finally, tier 5 was housing supply, was where we spent a lot of our conversation last time. That remains a key transformative focus of work as we move forward. As we've worked to develop our own internal efforts to move pieces forward on some of these tier 1 initiatives, we've also been meeting with the City of St. Paul and the St. Paul Public Schools. Between those two entities, they've received approximately $350 million in direct allocations of their own, not including our $106 million. So together, it's almost $500 million of ARP funding coming our way. And Alex and her peers in those two entities have been sitting down to talk about places of alignment and where people have different leadership roles and how do we do this in an ecosystem together, all the way down to the back office support models that we utilize, so we all don't architect a back office support solution when we could have thought this through together as a shared entity approach. Those conversations have borne significant fruit. I want to thank the schools, the school district, St. Paul schools, and the City of St. Paul for their work in that space. It helped today on the workforce conversation. It'll be a part of the housing conversation as we go forward. And it'll also be violence prevention work is the third area that's clearly been identified. There's an overarching layer to all of that as well about a whole family approach to how we do all of this work that the county is saying that must be a priority as we think about any approaches. How do we take whole family approaches and move away from these individualized pieces? I think the school district has a very strong role to play in that space. The city has an opportunity to be a part of that space, particularly in like the violence prevention spaces as well. So more to come on all of that. That's all I was going to share today on the look back. So as we go to today, there were 3 links at the bottom. I'll pause for a second on the look back piece, Mr. Chair, I see a hand.
Excuse me a minute, Brian. What was tier 3? Yeah, 3.
Tier 3 is pieces that'll come through the budget process, which is really opportunities to preserve and enhance our services coming out of COVID and the capital costs of transitioning from the organization we've been to the organization we're trying to become.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Do you want to take Commissioner McGinnis' question?
Jim? Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yep. Thanks, Raphael. A couple things. First off, that slide with the 5 tiers has just been invaluable. I've had to give presentations and talk about our approaches. People are really interested, and that one slide really kind of is the piece I use all the time when I'm working in community or talking to other organizations. The piece that I just want to raise here, and I think, working with St. Paul schools and the city of St. Paul is really critical. We really need to be thinking about what is our relationship and how to work with the Met Council. They're the Metro HRA in our community. They're getting a ton of money on the transit piece. We just went through the operational stuff. Our relationship and connection to Met Transit and the Met Council in so many ways of these parts of these tiers is going to be critical moving forward. But I think in the big piece here is the Metro HRA and that relationship. You know, Ryan, you talked about the X factor. There's an X factor out there with, you know, $5 billion worth of HUD money out there. And so I think we just want to make sure we start early in that relationship with them. It's not always been a strong connection between the Met Council, even though they're our regional kind of governance body here for the region. But I would suggest that we start that and establish that relationship as we're moving forward and they're having their conversations about their money also.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll make a direct outreach to the Met Council to bring them into the fold on these conversations, because as you're saying, that takes 500 million and adds another significant amount of money to that conversation. And there's clear alignment in that housing space and the transit space. We'll follow up with that. As we move forward and looking at the guidance and where we sit, I would point out that at the bottom of the agenda for today's workshop, we linked to 3 sets of info. We're going to specifically talk to the bottom of the 3 links, which is the link to NACO info. The National Association of Counties has done a really good job in helping to summarize the information in a way that those of us who are not great at reading Treasury interim or final guidance are able to understand. So for me, it was extremely helpful. It helped break it down in ways that got away from some of the bureaucratic speak and made it as clear as we could. I've asked Alex to briefly walk through the categories as we see them and how they somewhat align with what we know, and then we'll take questions and discuss from there.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. As Ryan mentioned, we are working off the NACO document, which summarizes a 150-page interim final rule that was issued from Treasury on May 10th. So we are continuing to review that and make sure that we understand all of the pieces. So this is our first, it is an interim final rule, which just means they have some time to update it based on feedback that they get from everyone across the country. So I wanted to just highlight the ARP process before we go into what the guidance says. So today you kind of saw it work in action. As Ryan mentioned, there are different tiers that we've laid out at the April 20th workshop. And then Ling Becker came forward today with the first request of ARP funds. That was for a tier 1 item. And how that works is the DCM and our department director would come to Ryan, the county attorney's office, compliance, and finance, and say, here, this is what we want to do. And we want to make sure it fits in tier 1. We want to make sure it fits within the guidance that has been issued, and then bring it forward to the board for consideration. The tier 2 through tier 5 that Ryan had mentioned will also be coming forward, but in a more planned and longer term way. Okay, so moving on to the NACO document, has 7 categories of eligible expenses. I'll spend quite a bit of time on the first couple, and then the other ones kind of, they're more overarching in areas where maybe we don't fit our tiers quite as much. But the first category is supporting the public health response. So I think of this a lot as tier 1. This is a continued response to the COVID-19 pandemic and what is needed. And so their wording are things like prevent and mitigate COVID-19. We have to identify the need, then we identify how the county investment addresses that need, and then explain how the investment responds to the disease itself or the harmful economic consequences. So it's pretty similar to what we were doing before, things like vaccination programs, testing, communication efforts, our trusted messenger work, PPE, some of the space updates that Ryan had mentioned, things to make our internal safe space, are also things to protect the community. A couple things that go beyond the more traditional what we did previously are enhancing behavioral health services. The federal government is recognizing the mental health, substance use, and crisis intervention that is related to this pandemic and the economic downturn. And that is also in this part of the bill. Support of local health and safety workforce. So staff services, this is where, how do we pay for our own staff, right? They have a whole separate section in here, but I'm going to talk about it here because they're talking specifically about our public health workers and public safety workers that are on the front lines of our response. And what this guidance, it's far more restrictive than the CARES Act, which makes sense because during CARES, we were all working all the time on COVID. Now we're doing certain things that are very, as they said before in the guidance, that are dedicated, a specific dedicated response to COVID. So they are saying the same thing about our staff. The staff services must be devoted to mitigating or responding to the COVID public health emergency. And you can no longer kind of just say, all of our public health is doing this or all of our public safety is doing this. We have to document who's actually responding to that. So more restrictive than CARES, but I think reflects where we are in terms of the pandemic and also allows us opportunity to get reimbursed for the work we are doing in this space. Another area that's called out in the bill specifically and speaks to something Ryan mentioned is addressing the disparities in public health outcomes. So a lot of what's written in this bill is based on qualified census tract. So you saw this morning the different zip codes and how those would relate to how we do outreach, how we do vaccination programs, how we do programs within the community. So they are including everything from housing services, housing insecurity, public benefit navigators, community health workers, community violence intervention. A lot of the things Ryan mentioned as tier 1, violence prevention, public health, wraparound families, they fit here because they're going to be, as we are the most diverse county and we've seen a disproportionate impact on communities of color from the public health angle and from the last year in the economic downturn. This is an area that is specifically called out in the guidance. So that's what's in number 1. I'm going to keep going to number 2 and then we'll take questions after, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Yes, go right ahead, Alex.
Great.
Unless, yeah, go ahead. Well, I have Mary. Go ahead, Mary Jo.
I mean, I'm having, excuse me.
You're muted, Mary Jo.
Thanks. Are you working off any documents? I know you said you were linking and I can't find the links actually that you referred to. So I don't know if you're working off anything. I have the workshop that we did in April. But if you're working off any other documents, I don't know where they are.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner McGuire, if you look at the agenda for today's workshop, at the very bottom, there are 3 links. The very bottom link is the specific document from which Alex is currently working.
So, and I find those links by going into the agenda in iLegislate, is that it?
Yes, I can send it to you quickly. I'll send it to you while we're talking.
That. I'm in iLegislate. I just didn't see the links. So I'm there. So I didn't see those links. So, okay, thanks.
Well,
Mr. Chair, Commissioner McGuire.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
could I mean, normally we get a PowerPoint, and I think that's what Mary Jo is thinking we have. And what you have at the bottom of this are the resources to the Treasury site, to the interim final rule, and the link to NACO. So we don't have a PowerPoint.
Correct.
And I think that's what you were potentially looking for.
Yeah, although I mean, I'm thinking you didn't have a PowerPoint. Oh, I see now. Now okay. I see it on there. Yeah, no, thank you, Commissioner Reinhardt. But now I see the resources link. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for that. I got him.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioner. And this is, I've read most of the guidance, the 150 pages, and I've worked with my colleagues in compliance in the county attorney's office. So this is based off of this, but also has context in other documents. But I think the NACO document, to Ryan's point, is extremely helpful and kind of takes the guidance and puts it in some plain language that's very useful and pertinent to counties specifically. Okay, so the second kind of big area around guidance is that addressing negative economic impacts. So we had a public health crisis, there are negative economic impacts associated with that. And the real kind of overarching area in this part is assistance to households. So there's a focus on preferably investing for the most disproportionately impacted households. Again, speaking to who was impacted the most by this public health crisis and by the economic downturn. So they talk about things like food supports, a lot of things that Ryan mentioned for tier 4 and some that are in tier 1 as well. Food supports, rent supports, mortgage, utilities, internet, job training, what we talked about this morning in terms of the Right Track Plus with Ling. Small businesses and nonprofit support, including technical assistance and work in that area. Assistance, this was interesting to me, assistance to unemployed workers, both unemployed due to the pandemic and who were unemployed prior to the pandemic. As we know from what Ling has mentioned, there were many people who had not recovered from previous economic downturn, and this just made it worse. And so they're recognizing that in this bill. Job training, and basically overall trying to get unemployed people back into the workforce. There's a piece in here that talks about improving the efficacy of our economic relief programs. And I think this speaks to when Ryan mentioned in the budget, how do we think about our programs now after we've had the experience regarding the pandemic, and what do they look like going forward? So they provide support for data analysis, for technical infrastructure, for evaluation, like our CARES evaluation. We should continue to work on things like that. It's covered in the ARP guidance. And then the tier 5, the overarching thing that we've been talking a lot about, affordable housing development, including the development of actual affordable housing. Again, they talk about qualified census tracts, and they talk about being able to live across an entire area and not just in certain parts of a county or a jurisdiction. And services to address homelessness, which we've invested heavily in from the beginning of the pandemic. And the last piece in this particular area is about promoting healthy childhood environment. And that gets to what we talked about with wraparound, right? So the mental health supports, the parent workforce supports, the school supports, the entire family, and thinking about how we wrap around families to support them coming out of the pandemic and economic downturn. Okay, the third piece is premium pay for essential workers. As you know, from the very beginning with this bill, there was mention of supporting the frontline workers that have been responding to this crisis for over a year. So what this bill says is that work involving regular in-person interactions or regular physical handling of items that are handled by others is allowed for premium pay. If you teleworked from a home office, it is from a residence, it is not eligible. You are not eligible for premium pay. So they are limiting that, and then they're prioritizing premium pay for low to moderate income employees. There's a theme in the bill, as you see. They're really thinking about how should these investments be made, and they're asking counties and local jurisdictions to prioritize pay for low to moderate income employees. They also, it's not just employees, I should expand that. It's employees and contracted vendors are eligible. So they don't have to be Ramsey County employees. They could be vendors doing work on behalf of Ramsey County. I'm going to pause for a second and see if there's questions on those first 3 major areas.
And I'll just add, as we transition, there is a departure in terms of what we said last time on the 20th about employee compensation and what we know now that there is interim guidance. We defined all employees as essential employees under the county's designation, under the governor's executive order, in order to keep service continuity back a little more than a year ago. The federal definition of how they are now defining this piece of the bill is more restrictive than what we used as a definition. And so in conversations going forward, like we obviously will have to apply the more restrictive federal definition. This is interim guidance, it's not final. And so there are places where what we say today isn't necessarily where it all ends, but we wanted to flag that for everybody.
Excuse me, Ryan, you say this is interim guidance. When do we get the final guidance?
I believe, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, I believe it's in August. I think they have 90 days from release till when they will take feedback. So the GFOA and NACO are getting feedback and will make changes. Although I believe the changes will be limited. That's what they indicated.
So help me process this real quick. So out of the 106 million, we get a first payment of 53 million.
Correct.
That 53 million comes to the bank when?
Today, as of the board receiving that money today.
Today, and you could start expending before final guidance?
Yes,
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Based on the interim final rule, the federal government allows you to start spending. And actually, our first report back to the federal government is due on August 31st. And so they expect you to start spending and using the funding based on this rule.
Yeah.
And to be fair, the CARES Act, they were updating guidance every couple weeks, and we have all those, and we pivoted and worked through it. So it's not it sounds odd when you say that out loud, but it's something we manage.
Well, no, and I know we could start spending money in areas that are quote unquote relatively safe to any changes, right? I'm just trying to get a handle on what the possibility, what changes might come about that might alter how we would spend money is how I'm trying to look at it. But okay, go ahead.
Sir, could I just ask a couple
Go ahead.
questions here? Yeah,
Oh, I'm
thank you.
sorry. I just saw the head. Go ahead, Mary Jo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Because now I've been linking, so I'm linked. I'm now on the NACO site, which got me to the Treasury site. Am I in the right place to be following what you're doing? If you could just direct me to if I'm linking to the right places. I'm familiar with all the things you're talking about. I'm not sure I'm linking to the right or maybe I'm not supposed to be following anything that you're saying. If you're just talking generally, I can just take notes. But if you're referencing anything that I could be following, I'd like that.
Madam,
as well.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner
Yeah.
McGuire, I just sent it. I sent you the direct link if you check your email.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I just wanted to go back and touch base on that last piece you were talking about, Alex, especially in relationship to premium pay for employees. I think as you know, we're moving forward, and I just wanted to make sure I use this as an opportunity at least to give my feedback. I would suggest we be very cautious and very conservative when we look at that. That can eat up a lot of money quickly, and it's one-time money. And there's always, we've got to come back to a normal, right? And I know there'll be a lot of pressure, or at least some pressure, for us to be responsive in that area. And I would just suggest that it's an area that we should be very cautious if we open up that door, suggesting that premium pay is warranted for this type of work, and making sure that that definition is, you know, it's been narrowed by the federal government for a reason, and making sure that we're utilizing that in a narrow way moving forward. And I do think, Alex, you pointed out that they're looking for an emphasis on lower paid positions within the county. I think in general, a lot of folks looked at this ARP money as a poverty bill also, right? There is this kind of hope that some of these things will actually help lift people out of poverty and help sustain people moving forward. And so we're seeing a lot of those connections. And I think that's really important for us in Ramsey County, with these huge areas of racially concentrated areas of poverty that we have, and ensuring that we utilize this in our decision making the best way we can to move forward in making those connections. But at least from my perspective, premium pay for employees should be really a cautious approach.
You want to go ahead, Alex.
Okay. Mr. Chair, Commissioners. Okay, the next area, I just wanted to note my
Excuse me. Excuse me,
I'm sorry.
Mr. Chair, I had my hand up.
I didn't see it. Go ahead, Victoria.
That's okay. I just wanted to note also, because there is pressure to put things, one-time money into things that are ongoing and not sustainable if we don't look at that. And so when I have talked to folks about this, it's quite frankly, it's not that it's not warranted, because I mean, we've got people that are really putting it all out there, and and doing a fantastic job. We all know that. But if you set up an artificial cliff, it doesn't end up helping people in the long run. And so I have the same caution, but I wanted to state really why that's important is we've said many, many times, you don't pay your rent out of your savings account because it's one-time money. And at some point, you have to deal with that, what I would call a cliff. And so being very cautious and moving forward with that. But I think that, you know, our staff has just been absolutely incredible in the response that they've had. And trying to figure out how you can balance that is going to be really critical without having a cliff. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. I
Go
wanted
ahead,
to
Ed.
just mention, Mr. Chair, that my colleagues in the county attorney's office did define the interim final rule for me previously. And what it means is when the Treasury doesn't have time to publish a rule in advance, they call it an interim final rule. And then if warranted, once they get feedback from the public and organizations, they will change the rule. But it is the rule under which we function today. Okay, so moving on to the fourth category in the bill, it's the payroll cost kind of for public health and public safety. I mentioned this in the first area. I'll just mention it again. It's more restrictive than CARES, and it's very specific to the time devoted to COVID-19. And so we will have to work very diligently to make sure that we have that tracked and be able to articulate what employees, if we charge Ramsey County employee time to the ARP funds, that what they are doing is directly related to COVID-19 response. Okay, the fifth area, and this is getting a lot of attention in the finance world, is replacing public sector revenue loss.
I'm sorry, repeat that again, Alex?
Sure, it is the replacing public sector revenue loss. So if you remember correct, in the CARES Act, you could not actually replace revenue. So many jurisdictions, particularly cities, were hard hit in terms of revenue loss, and they were unable to use the CARES funding to replace that revenue. This bill, the ARP bill, allows you to do revenue loss, but it is a very complicated formula that is an enterprise-wide look. So we have to look across all of our revenues, not specific. I couldn't say our arena revenues were down compared to the previous year. I have to look at the entire enterprise-wide revenue. And over time, compared to a previous 12 months, I won't go into the details, but it's pretty specific. I think it's unlikely to apply to us in a substantial way, in anything it maybe would be a minimal use to us. I do think cities are going to be able to take advantage of that, and potentially the state. And then once you do replace that revenue, you're able to use those ARP funds in a very broad way for anything, basically anything your government does. I don't think that, the tiers that Ryan laid out in the board workshop didn't really speak to this, because we kind of knew where we had trouble wasn't in losing revenue over the past year. We are more on the front lines of a direct response to the public health and economic crisis. But I want to pause because I know that gets a lot of attention out there, at least in my world.
Excuse me, Trista?
Yeah, thank you. Does that include our loss in revenue with the levy or not?
That's an excellent question. I would say no, because you passed the levy at 0%. So it was never that we were sent out bills for 4.5% and collected less than that.
But there are other places in the bill that we think that question applies to more strongly. It's just the calculation of revenue loss specifically. I mean, we could look in a targeted way at Parks and Rec, and that would be the one area where you would see some revenue loss with arenas, for example. But it's a pretty small way for us to approach how we allocate and think about the funding.
Okay, if I can just ask a follow-up then. So on revenue loss could also be like we receive repayment or reimbursement for people at the care center or at Lake Owasso, and some of those were returned home because of the pandemic. Would that be considered a revenue loss?
Yes, those would be, yes, the short answer is yes, we did receive an increased rate to account for that in some
Okay.
areas. So that kind of softened or mitigated not all of the costs. They did have additional costs due to COVID, and they continue to have additional costs due to COVID, but it would address that.
Okay, thank you.
So Alex, let me clarify something. So we get the gist here that our costs in terms of revenue loss, no matter what categories you look at, are minimal. But are we gonna submit them anyway, no matter how minimal? Or are we just, it's not worth the, I'm trying to get a handle on what we're talking about.
Mr. Chair, I would say right now, from a perspective, there's a reason we did not put revenue replacement on our 5 tiers of asks with the board in the first workshop. It's not because we couldn't, and if we saw something dire, we would like to be able to bring something to the board to think about it. We were able to last year cover parks losses in the strategy of how we managed our budget. It was hard. We lost a few $1 million. I credit EGCI and finance and the entire organization for being able to do it. But I think the money is probably going to be better spent in places other than on revenue replacement for the county.
So let me ask you this, if at the end of the day, we get the first 53 million, then we'll get the second 53 million, and we're counting down to the last million down the road. And could we then go back to fill in, to plug in the gaps in the budget, so to speak, or in the accounting?
Yep, Mr. Chair, you can, and actually it goes forward. So if we were to unexpectedly see a revenue decline over the course of this year or next year, we could still use that provision all the way through the end of December of 2024.
All right, well, that's good. So we could keep that for the back end, so to speak. As I say, to account for the last $1 million.
Yep.
Okay, all right, go ahead. Oh, Jim.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. On the revenue loss in relationship to Parks and Rec, and I know we had some issues early on. I don't know how far we could. For the most part, the revenue losses, we just, golf fees or whatever. But in our arenas, we have youth groups or nonprofits that actually are contracted to us to purchase ice. And then they were hit, COVID came in, they couldn't utilize the ice, they couldn't use it, or, and they do this, 6 months out, right? They were buying summer ice last year, but pre-COVID, for their clinics and all that. And I know there was a lot of struggling with those. We didn't, there wasn't a lot of help for nonprofits to be able to help manage that. And I know I made some connections, Ryan, to you with some of our hockey groups about exploring that. But as we move forward, especially on the revenue loss, if we're at a spot where we're recapturing the potential for revenue loss, is there a pass through? So we're not, being made whole, but then our contract holders are still liable and responsible for contracts that they may not have used any ice hours because of COVID didn't allow them to come together and practice or play their games.
So, Mr. Chair, Commissioner, I think what the answer to your question is we could do that depending on, what the board recommends and what we decide to do. So I think it would be a 2-step. We could recapture the revenue loss, and then there is an area under negative economic impacts that cover small businesses and nonprofits, and helping, just like we did last year, with loans and grants to cover losses there. So there is a path for that. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make sure we're thinking about that,
Right.
it's complex and the threads are woven and not always direct connections, right? But if this art money allows us to be made whole in areas where we need to be made whole, and if there's a connection to, whether it's a small business or a nonprofit or a community-based organization that had that impact, and we can, pass along some of that being made whole. I just want to make sure we're thinking in those types of terms to have that type of benefit within our community.
Commissioner McDonough, the last piece I'll add is right now, it's not our intent at this point to make ourselves whole. It's to figure out ways to manage through these spots, which is not to say that nonprofits who are going to run at tighter margins may not have an issue. And I would rather work really hard here with our organization to not make us whole so we can support more nonprofits, more families, build more housing, for example, as we go forward. That would be the approach today.
So
Thank
Ryan,
you.
let me ask you this, are we putting nonprofits and small business in the same category, or are they separate categories?
Mr. Chair, I think in the economic development approach going forward about the ecosystem, that's going to apply far more to small businesses or to businesses. I would imagine we'll focus on micro and small as a part of that, women-owned, minority-owned businesses. So I would not see them the same when we talk about our tier 4 investment here, working with our partners around an ecosystem. The nonprofit question is a big one, and it's a big one not only here, but across the state. And these are some of those areas too, where I do hope that the state of Minnesota, who got a large allocation of ARP funding, thinks about their role, right? And how do you, nonprofits don't often exist just in one county and one ecosystem. And this is one of those spots where we're kind of hoping that our partners may actually do something too.
Okay, Jim, you have your hand up again? Oh, all right, go ahead, Alex.
Great. So the last two areas I want to mention are in the bill that are covered are water and sewer infrastructure. So clean water projects, drinking water projects, stormwater, flood. And then the other one is broadband infrastructure. These are, as Ryan said, probably areas that the state will invest heavily in, or at least there's some talk of that. You never know when it comes to the legislature, as you talked about earlier. I don't see those directly applying, maybe in some small areas to the county. I wanted to highlight a few things that are absolutely not eligible for these funds. You cannot put money into your pension, to your debt service, to your rainy day fund, in general infrastructure. So they talked about like roads, bridges, jails, that type of infrastructure is not allowed. Economic development, unless it's a direct response. So again, they talked about like roads and they kind of all come together in that area. And they are expecting, the other thing I want to mention is they are expecting any jurisdiction with over 250,000 people, so this would apply to Ramsey, to submit recovery plan performance reports starting in August of 21. So we will get to lay out all the good work we do with this money, who it impacts, and how it aligns closely with the guidance. And the last thing I wanted to say is I am not concerned about spending all of this money. Like I'm not concerned. We spent the 96 million in about 9 months. Right now we have the 53.4 million in the bank. We'll get another 53.4. This morning, you actually approved an additional nearly $11 million of part of the X, right? For the emergency rental assistance and some public health money and some FEMA money. We continue to work those grants and continue to work with the state to find ways to partner. So I have every confidence that over this long time frame that we'll be able to leverage these funds and spend all of them. That's all I had.
Okay, I have Nicole and Mary Jo, but before I bring on Nicole, let me ask you a question on the info. So what could we spend capital? You mentioned earlier that we could spend on capital. What is that related to?
Yeah, I can give you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, I can give you more of a technical. So definitely affordable housing, that is mentioned specifically. You can also spend infrastructure kind of capital money on your own space to make it more responsive post-COVID. Anything that might be, so for example, maybe the care center or LOR that would be responding directly to COVID and how we leverage that space. It has to be specific.
I'll give the best specific example I could probably highlight for the board. While we don't have any specific plans, so please don't pin me down to go too far right now, but we stood up service centers on the fly in sites, some of which we want to keep moving forward as those sites long-term. But our physical space isn't configured correctly. We didn't build our libraries with the vision of a service center in mind. And we didn't budget in our long-term capital planning up until now with those in there. That would be an eligible expense that we may want to consider and move forward. Those types of pieces or other parts of how to make your buildings more welcoming and residents first in the new environment we're operating in as we move beyond COVID.
All right, thank you, Nicole.
Thank you, Chair Ortega. On the wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, have we had any conversations with our watershed districts about areas that where we see a lot of naturally occurring affordable housing that are at high risk in the floodplains? I know we have an area in the Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed District. It's actually in Commissioner McGuire's district in Little Canada, of naturally occurring affordable housing that is our highest risk area of flooding in that watershed. Is that an option for making improvements to mitigate the flood risks to preserve that housing for using those funds? And if so, is that the sort of conversation our watershed districts could be having with us?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Fredham, thank you for the question. That conversation hasn't specifically happened to date, so thank you for flagging it. That's one of those pieces. That's why we're having the discussion today. We can bring it back and think about it. I was asking Alex on the fly. There's a spot here where we need to go back and do a little more look at the information. So I'm going to flag a spot we don't know exactly right now. I've gotten some conflicting info around where you can do investments in affordable housing and whether that's tied to qualified census tracts or not. We hope it's not, candidly. I think that really restricts the ability to build supply housing and ensure that people can live where they want to live throughout the entire community. And it has an impact. Your question actually could have an impact on our answer there. That's a follow-up piece that I'll share with you in the coming weeks at a board meeting or something when we can get it. And hopefully they'll tell us it can be in any community, because that's a good thing for our entire community.
Okay, Mary Jo?
Thanks, Nicole, for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. That was actually along the lines of a question that I had about how are we coordinating with all units of government, the watersheds and school districts and cities. And I know we're working with St. Paul on a number of things with St. Paul City and St. Paul School District on some of that. What is our plan for coordinating with all of our suburban cities and school districts to make sure that we've all optimized all of our funding? So could you just talk a little bit about what that might look like? And I'm glad Nicole brought up watersheds, because that's just a whole nother area of local government that we should be talking to.
Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair, Commissioner McGuire, I think there's a couple layers to that question, that answer. First, the funding allocations look very different this time than they did under CARES. And I think that's important because smaller communities received exponentially less relative to larger urban areas, where in many cases the impacts of COVID were most felt. So you see a huge difference in terms of investment levels of direct allocation. And it does lead to a differing level of involvement in pre-planning so far, because a lot of communities don't feel like they have the same amount to really bring to the table this time through. And that's a part we have to go. At the same time, we had a meeting with the city administrators about a month and a half ago, a little bit before that April 20th conversation with the board, in which we talked about the tier 1 through 5 approach that we would be bringing to the board. We shared that tier 5 was around housing in particular, and had a real robust conversation, right? About that and what does that mean, right? Because we can't do this work without willing partners at the municipal level. And so in many cases, when it comes to things like zoning and comprehensive plans and implementation, we rely upon our city partners to be able to have an ecosystem that allows the investment to be maximized. And so we'll continue those dialogues and conversations there. That's kind of where we're at point in time right now.
I appreciate that. And just because, of course, a number of us are out talking to our cities, and because they're not getting as high an allocation, they do want to maximize it. And they see partnering, I think, as being helpful to them, that they can add their money and get a little more maybe to what we might be able to bring to the table, knowing that it's not equal for sure. But just, I'm glad those are conversations that we're having, because I'll just say that the cities I've talked to, the schools, they're interested in maximizing whatever they have. So I'm just hoping that we continue to have those conversations. And Mr. Chair, I have a couple other questions. Is this money, how closely does it have to be tied to the pandemic? Remind me about that. I mean, I know the CARES dollars had to be really directly linked. Can you remind me how close this new American Rescue Plan money, how direct? Because we could argue, obviously, I mean, that a lot of these things, we started during the pandemic, we want to continue, but they may not be pandemic related in the continuance, of course. So just remind me about that.
So, Mr. Chair, Commissioner McGuire, I would say it sort of depends.
Yeah.
If you're talking about staff time, it has to be directly related to a COVID response. There's a broader piece in this bill that's really addressing the economic downturn and where you saw the pandemic impact people the most. And so it has broad ability to invest. You see a theme here in people disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and also the economic downturn. That's why they're using qualified census tracts to get at where was their impact, where was the most impact across the nation. They talk about things like behavioral health supports, mental health supports, substance use disorder, affordable housing, rent assistance, mortgage assistance, broadband, things that came out and exacerbated disparities that existed prior to the pandemic that were exacerbated during the pandemic and the economic downturn. And leveraging this money, you can see clearly they want counties and states and cities to leverage this money to change the outcome for people most impacted. I think the chair mentioned that people talk about this as a poverty bill. I would reframe it as an investment in the communities most impacted, not just by this pandemic and the economic downturn, but previously by so many years of different economic impacts and issues in our society that we're all aware of. And this bill is open to you investing, allows counties to invest in those spaces.
Thank you. I really appreciate that answer. That's good. It's all good. And I'm glad you've got a great response on that. So thank you for that. And then my last question, Mr. Chair, is I haven't heard much about this. Like if this local communities aren't able to invest their dollars, which it does surprise me that they couldn't. I'm guessing most everybody's going to find a way to invest. But is there if they don't invest it, does it go back to the state or where does it go? I remember this conversation during the CARES money, but I don't know it in terms of these dollars.
Madam Chair, Commissioner McGuire, it wouldn't go back to the state in this case. It's a slightly different, it's an allocation direct from the feds. So I assume it would go back to the feds. We're all trying to figure out how to spend it. We haven't figured out how to take advantage of someone else's money who didn't spend it.
I mean, that's what I'm saying, that maybe some of our local smaller communities want to work with us so they can spend it for sure, right?
Sure,
I'm sure we're not going to have trouble.
Yes.
I just was gonna, it's incentive for all of our smaller communities to work with people on spending it. Thanks.
Jim, did you have your hand up?
I do.
Okay, and then Victoria.
All right, thank you. I wanted to talk about the rental assistance piece a little bit. During CARES, we actually allocated a good chunk of money towards rental assistance. It was undersubscribed somewhat, and I know we actually kind of adjusted and went to a landlord assisted program where landlords could apply directly when their tenants were behind. I think that was really smart because a lot of times the renters, this isn't the first thing on their mind. But we keep talking about this cliff of evictions coming forward. And I just want to make sure there's two things. One is I know there's other organizations operating within Ramsey County that are doing rental assistance. At our last COC meeting, continuum care meeting, we allowed some of our contract holders to actually adjust some of their money towards rental assistance. Maybe that might be part of the reason it was undersubscribed in CARES, is there are other opportunities out there. But I want to just make sure that as we're looking at this and recognizing that there's this cliff, you know, if we need to adjust to a landlord assistance type program where landlords can apply directly, I don't know if that works with this money or not. But then you know, this just occurred to me as I was preparing to talk about this is, you know, if we're helping ensure that, you know, a tenant is current, whether it's a direct allocation to the tenant so they can, you know, pay their rent, or it's a allocation to the landlord so that, you know, their tenants are current. I'm hoping there's some requirement that when the eviction notice is lifted, they can't go back and evict those folks because they were behind in rent, right? So the landlord actually got made whole, which I know it's a big problem. We want to make sure our landlords are, you know, being able to make whole, but not hold it against that, where this is meant to soften that cliff and making sure that folks can continue to stay in their housing. So a couple things there. Do we have flexibility to support landlords in a direct landlord assistance program? And then is with that money, no matter which way it's going, are there requirements that landlords cannot evict folks if they are made whole by the CARES or our funding?
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner McDonough, I wish Director Tina Curry was here because she's done such great work in this space, but she did end up, we had a little tagline for her, spend the money. She did end up spending all of her money, $15 million by the end between the landlord program and the direct assistance program. But you are right, they were undersubscribed originally. She has worked really hard you all asked us at a certain point to partner. And so she is actually working with the state, Hennepin County, Minneapolis, St. Paul, I believe
Dakota.
Washington County, Dakota, maybe St. Louis.
I don't know. I signed the contract on this morning.
It's Anoka. Anoka County to do a landlord program, because as you know, many landlords have different properties across those jurisdictions. And so they all got money from the emergency rental assistance, and they're investing it there. She's also standing up a direct assistance program for Ramsey County residents. And there are requirements within the landlord program that they may not evict people over a certain period of time. I know she can give you more details, but she's done a great job with her team and with partnering with the local jurisdictions to make sure that money gets out, and partner with the state, which I think has been a really great experience for us.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really great to hear. And it does bring me a little bit of comfort, because I think the worst case scenario would be where we're able to support our landlords in making sure that they can cash flow their businesses with these dollars, but then tenants still end up getting evicted because they were behind in their rent at some point in time in this. And we just can't let that happen if we can stop that from happening. So thank you.
Victoria?
Thank you. One thing that's of concern to me is, and I know we understand it, but I think we have to be careful about how we're communicating about making sure we spend all this money. It's like, oh, we got some money, so let's just go out and spend it. And I mean, it really is investing in our residents first, our economic recovery, and how we go about doing this, because the reason it's there is because there is a real need, and we want to make sure that we get it out there and do what we can to really have it be the American Rescue Plan. And so I know that, again, we all understand that, but people are listening, and it sounds like we've got this extra money. I've said it before, even our legislators talk about how are we going to spend this extra money. It's not about being extra money. It's about the need being so immense. And how do we make sure that we spend it in a way that's going to have the outcomes that we want? We can spend money. That's not the issue, but it's what is its purpose, and how are we using it, and how are we leveraging it to have the best outcomes for our community as we try to recover and rescue people, especially the people that are living in poverty, which, as we all know, are disproportionately people of color. And so it's hard sometimes when you're talking about the money and how quickly we have to make decisions on how it gets allocated. But I do think working with our communities, just as we did before. I mean, there were a lot of our municipalities and our nonprofit partners, all the partners really came together for the CARES Act and got that information out there. So that is one thing. One other thing that I think is really important, although, you know what, I appreciate the links that were included on the agenda. However, we really need to have something that is very easy to understand. And some of the big questions, anyhow, it covers those. I know that we had an overview of the art money and some of the other funds, because it's not just about them, it's about the leveraging of all these other programs and pools of funds, and how do we make sure that we maximize that. And we had a presentation that really kind of had the tiered look of what are the different pools of funds and how can they be used. And I think that it's going to be critically important that we have something that is a fact sheet on what is covered, what is not, where there are potentials for leveraging funds that we can put out on the website. And I know this is all new, and I know that it could possibly change, but probably not very much, as was pointed out. It's an interim final rule, which seems like an oxymoron to us all, I think. But the fact is, they did it that way so that they could get the information out to us as quickly as possible. And maybe there are some tweaks that they missed, and we'll deal with those, but they're not going to change the programming significantly. So having something that can go to our partners, that can actually even be just distributed to the county board, is going to be very important. And so I know, for example, I mean, even with the what we passed this morning, and Ling and Workforce Solutions being willing to go out and talk to those that are most impacted, the stakeholders, to say what is something that you can access and what can't you access, or what isn't allowed. That's so important, because the businesses, the employers, the people looking for work, they see, oh, there's money that's come in, but they don't really understand exactly how that impacts them. And so I think we need some basic communication tools that really talk about this. And as I said, what is allowed, what isn't, how they can get a presentation that has some materials that are left behind so that they can consume it as they need it, or as they want to learn more. So I hope that we can put together some sort of a presentation that can be put on the website and or provided to the commissioners, and provided to the commissioners, so that when we're out in the community, because people are looking to us to be able to explain this, and you can tell by the number of questions we had here, we don't have what we need to be able to do that. And I think that that's going to be important, that there's some sort of a frequently asked questions that we can at least point to, that will help people understand what we're doing and why we have to do it as quickly as we do. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Reinhardt, I'll work backwards through the two, I think, just from point of ease. On the second part, we agree, want to get information out. You know, we also had the regular and frequent CARES spend reporting up on the website. We were one of the only counties that I know of that did that work. It was a voluntary piece around our own compliance and transparency. And that starts to show how it stitches together. And we've actually gotten asked for it many times over time to understand what we did, when, and where. We need to do that here. We will be doing some of that. Today really was about a discussion, not a workshop where we were coming in with it all fully done. We really pulled the guidance we've got and said, let's do the best we can with what we have today. So acknowledge that's why we kind of wanted the questions, and we decided it was probably better to do it here. So we had a recording of it and can even share this as a part. Final piece on that I think is a big piece to how we communicate. there is more eligible stuff than there is money to fund the eligible stuff through our direct allocation. And so what's actually very important, I believe, from the county's perspective, is to articulate what we began a conversation on April 20th, and then overlaying the guidance as to whether or not that strategic direction can still be followed going forward. Because there are many things in that strategic direction that did not necessarily get outlined that could still be invested in according to the guidance. And so communities that want to use only the guidance to guide those discussions would kind of be at a loss, because they lose the part that the board is being asked to make choices. We are working as an organization to do that. I think today's workforce is a really good microcosm example of where we're trying to go. It leverages partnership, it's countywide in its approach. It's not just county funding that went into it. It's focused in a targeted area of need. We've done a lot of walk around pieces, like you said. That's kind of the model for a lot of how we're trying to think through this as we go. So noted on that communication front all the way along. On the spending piece, I appreciate those comments. Thank you for sharing them. Absolutely, it's about meeting the need as the need has increased. I think the one part that is a big thing for us as internal, and you're hearing it in our discussion today, is it's not always all that easy to spend money. It's your systems as legacy systems don't fund 100 new vendors in workforce all that well. Or when you have barriers that have been built up over time, we've hit those barriers through these processes. And so this mantra of not only allocate but spend has been an important part of our internal speak on behalf of this community to ensure the money doesn't languish in our hands, because of the need that you cited very clearly in what you were saying. And the final part to that I think is really important is we've seen some chatter at the national level saying, hey, not all the money's being spent through these relief bills, let's reallocate it toward infrastructure or somewhere else. And hopefully what you see through this and here today, if nothing else, is please do not let that happen. We need every dime here, and we need the infrastructure investment, because that would allow us to continue to make investments. And so I hope that adds nuance to some of what you shared, but no disagreement anywhere there.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Or Alex, Ryan, are we good?
Yeah, this was really helpful. Just so you know, a lot of staff were discuss where we're at to point in time on this work. Everybody wants clarity today on all of it. And I'll close with something that I believe we talked about in April, but if not, it's been a rallying piece with staff, which is we were defined by our speed to get money out the door with the CARES money last time. $90 million, 9 months, totally different ballgame. I think this time success will be defined by doing some things quickly that are needed right now. Today was one example. And doing many things as strategically as possible to ensure good outcomes today, tomorrow, and into the future. And so we are trying to be more
a sense of how it's moving, some type of graphic that helps us communicate easier to our constituents, because we are getting a lot of questions. But thank you.
We will work with communications on that piece.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
good lunch. See you this afternoon.
Thanks. Thanks, Raphael.
Good meeting.